And Mark Malchoff is an Aquatic Resources Specialist with Lake Champlain Sea Grant. Welcome back. It's good to see you again.
Good to be here.
You were part of our panel a couple of years ago when we talked about microplastics showing up in the lake. Senator Gillibrand really helped get the ball rolling back in 2015. She got Congress to ban the little plastic microbeads in the facial scrubs and in the toothpaste that were beginning to turn up in waterways across the country. But researchers at SUNY Fredonia and here at SUNY Plattsburgh were even more concerned about what they were finding, small fragments of plastic were turning up in the water back then. Sherry Mason at SUNY Fredonia and Danielle Garneau here at SUNY Plattsburgh were starting to do the work on that and seeing more evidence of that than the little microbeads. And so where are we with the microplastics? Is that still a problem for Lake Champlain?
A big deal nationally, and it's a big deal here, as we're finding out. And just to remind viewers of the pathway, they don't start out as microplastics. A lot of this stuff starts out as macroplastics. You know, whether it's bottles or toys or some other product that breaks down from mechanical processes or ultraviolet light. And plastics don't go away, they just continue to break down into smaller and smaller chunks. So that explains a lot of the fragments that you can find in
So this
sampling.
is waste plastic that's getting in
and then
the lake.
But the biggest type of plastic they find are fibers from synthetic clothing.
And that's new within the past decade or two.
Sure.
The fleece, the synthetic clothing that we wear, the fibers come off in the wash.
Yep.
Washing machines don't have filters to catch it.
No, there's some technology that's been investigated, and some people are starting to use it. You can put a filter downstream from your washing machine to capture this stuff, and there's mechanical devices that you can put in your clothes dryer that can capture some of this stuff. And I've seen mixed reviews on the performance of those devices, but it's kind of below most people's radar screen as to whether we need this stuff or not. And most of us don't even think about it. We just take the clothing, launder it, and out of sight, out of mind.
So it goes down the drain, and when it gets to the wastewater treatment plants, many of them don't have filters or any means of
think
capturing
about
it.
All the wastewater treatment infrastructure in the country and in the Lake Champlain Basin were conceived, engineered, designed, built 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Nobody had heard about microplastics. They certainly weren't designed to capture this stuff. They're designed to capture nutrients and remove them before they get to a swimmable, fishable water body. So it's a brand new problem. And so a lot of this work that Danielle has done is just to try to document what's going on.
So the project to look into the microplastics is something a Sea Grant has been funding, and the work has been going on at Plattsburgh State.
Correct. The way we typically run these projects, Sea Grant sets aside a certain chunk of their budget to fund research. We put out an RFP, request for proposals, and scientists in the basin or outside the basin can apply for those funds. And Danielle, Dr. Garneau at SUNY Plattsburgh applied for those funds back in 2016, I guess, and she received an award from us to spend a couple of years kind of documenting this problem, along with some other folks at SUNY Plattsburgh at the Lake Champlain Research Institute.
So how have they been trying to document it? What have they been doing in the lake to try to identify if this is a real problem?
A few different things. There's this long-term monitoring program that was funded by the Basin Program starting in '92, I believe, to really focus on water chemistry in phytoplankton and zooplankton. Those samples are archived and they're available, and just kind of by happenstance, some of the staff at the Lake Champlain Research Institute noticed foreign objects in those samples, and Danielle proposed to take a deeper dive into those samples, which is kind of neat. This stuff is already on the shelf. It's collected for a totally different purpose, but in the process of being there, there were samples, there were microplastics in those samples, and she took the opportunity to document when, where, how.
And so these water samples go back into the early '90s.
Correct.
So that's quite a wealth of evidence there. And
Yeah.
go back and look over. So what did she find when she went back and looked?
Well, she was especially
over the
interested in
samples?
these rubber, foam rubber particles that we're finding. Kind of a spike in these things showing up in the samples in 2012, and then, but not much before then and not much after then.
So right in the mid-2000s, there was a spike, and these are little rubber pellets?
Yeah, pre-production rubber pellets that there's it's kind of more of a foam than a rubber, and we're still are kind of puzzled as to the origin of these things, where they may have originated, why they spiked then and haven't been seen lately. One thing we think is part of the puzzle is viewers will remember that in 2011 we had some pretty high water around here. There was record spring flooding in Lake Champlain in May, June, even into July. Lake dropped back to almost all normal, and then Irene hit in the fall. Levels went back up again. So we think there's a connection there. The lake's never been that high since. Did that explain some of this distribution or not? So Dr. Garneau was able to document that in the samples. So the maps are out there, the distribution and densities of these particles are out there, and we're still trying to scratch our head and figure out where it's from and why we haven't seen it again, that sort of thing.
Odd. And at the same time, did they also look at some of the microorganisms living in the lake and work their way up the food chain to see if there's evidence of these microplastics in some of the organisms and wildlife living in the lake and around
certainly
the lake?
Looked at ingestion of microplastics by zooplankton, fish, even apex predators. In the case of cormorants, it's kind of interesting because you think about how high up the food chain they are. So the question is, well, if there's a little bit of this plastic at this lower trophic level and then something eats that organism and they live longer and eat a lot, will they have more plastic than the lower level organism, and then so on up the food chain? And that seemed to have been borne out by the research results that they've got. As you move up the food chain, you see more plastic in the digestive tract of organisms as you move from zooplankton to larger zooplankton to fish that eat zooplankton to fish that eat those fish to birds that eat those fish, and so on.
So they did find some in the cormorants.
Oh yeah, every organism that they've looked at, aquatic organism that they've looked at, they found microplastics. Yeah, so they've found the microplastics in bass and cormorants and lake trout and in sunfish and isopods and mysids and you name it.
So if they're finding them in the bass and in the perch and fish that we consume, does that mean it's likely that we've consumed it and it's in us as well?
Pretty good chance. And other scientists have found microplastics in water. We've found it in beer. So
we're ingesting it.
We're ingesting it.
But there's no sign that we're ingesting it in such large amounts that it's causing health concerns or problems for us.
That's a really sticky question.
You were at a Sea Grant conference just a few weeks ago back in September, and that's one of the topics that was discussed there.
Right. Long story short, it's a really mixed bag. Small organisms like bosminid zooplankton in a lab setting, you can demonstrate negative impacts. If you move to large organisms or move into the wild, the impacts are a lot less obvious and maybe not necessarily negative, but the jury's still out on that.
So as the microplastics are discovered, are there concerns about the impact they're having on the lake?
Yeah, and Dr. Garneau has developed a very good relationship with wastewater treatment plant operators to see, if some of this stuff can be captured, even though these plants were not designed to do so. I think they're continuing to tweak some of their processes and add downstream filtration. You see a drastic difference in fibers, fragments, foam, and more from one plant than to the next. And it's a complex question. All these plants use slightly different technologies. They were built different times with different engineers and so on. But they're trying to capture this stuff before it gets in the lake if they can, along with all their other challenges. Again, they're mandated to reduce nutrient input.
Right.
They're not mandated to capture microplastics, but a lot of these folks are trying their best, and they're very interested in some of the research results. On the back side of the problem is we should be focusing on ways to keep plastics from escaping into the environment, breaking down, not be as concerned as about capturing the stuff in a wastewater stream. Let's try to prevent it from getting there in the first place.
And are we taking steps in that direction? New York State has implemented a ban on plastic bags beginning next March, and there's the awareness about plastic straws, and is that at least starting to deal with the problem?
We're nibbling around the edges, or getting to the low-hanging fruit, pick your metaphor. There's the plastic bags, I think, is an important discussion, because clearly these things can break down in the environment. And you think about how many minutes they're actually going to get used, and they're going to be around, forever. So I'm hopeful that'll make a bit of a difference.